Hello, thank you so much to everyone who came out here. I am Mimi Montgomery, I'm your moderator, and I am here with Liz Moore and Chris Whitaker to talk about their excellent, most recent novels. And so to start our convo, I just wanted to kind of kick things off, generally speaking, and ask you each how you came up with the ideas for these books, and sort of how did the idea first come to you for each of you?
Shall I? Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Mimi, for moderating. Thanks, Chris, for being on stage with me. I would say The God of the Woods had several sources of inspiration. The first and most obvious is it's set in the Adirondack Mountains of upstate New York, and I have a long family history in the Adirondacks. In the early 1800s, 4 of my ancestors moved to the Adirondacks to start basically subsistence farms. And they remained there for about a century until they were displaced by a government works project and settled just south of there, which is where my mother and my grandmother were born and raised. I still go to the Adirondacks regularly because my grandparents built a cabin in the southern Adirondacks. It's still a very important place to our family, and so the sense of place in the book is inspired pretty directly by the real place, the Adirondack Mountains. There are other sort of real life stories that influence the novel as well. One of them is the real serial killer Robert Garrow, who haunted the Adirondack Mountains in the 1970s. And there is a secondary character in The God of the Woods, who goes by a different name, but who is pretty directly inspired by Garrow. And then other than that, there's a really strong, like many rural places that have become vacation places, there's a strong sense of division between classes in the Adirondacks. And that's something that comes very much into play in The God of the Woods, which has a real kind of upstairs, downstairs theme with a very, very wealthy family who has built a summer home in the mountains and a summer camp for the children of the wealthy down the hill. And also the people who staff the camp, who are locals and who do not have many resources. So that too is drawn from research and history and lived experience as well.
Hi, thank you all for coming. Thank you for being on stage with me. I'd say I had this really simple top-line pitch for the new book, for All the Colours of the Dark, and it was 2 abducted teenagers fall in love in the pitch-black basement they're being held in, having never seen each other. The boy escapes, can't find his way back to the girl. The police don't believe that she's real. They think that he made her up because of the trauma of what he's been through, but he knows in his heart that she is. So I kind of had this mystery set up, and then I began writing it, and I was in a weird place in my career because my first 2 books, they did well critically, but like they didn't sell that well. So I was working 3 jobs and never saw my kids, and so I pitched this mystery to my editor, and I said I'd deliver it in a year, it'd be published in 2 years, and then We Begin at the End came out, and it came out during lockdown. So whilst it was a New York Times bestseller and did what the other books didn't do, I felt kind of disconnected because all of the events were on Zoom, and they were all at like 2 a.m. because of the time difference in the UK. So I was exhausted, and I had this idea, and I began writing it, and then everyone started reading We Begin at the End. And that book follows a year in the life of a 13-year-old girl. So we meet her at 13, leave her at 14. And everyone that read it was messaging me saying, what happens next? What happens to this girl? And I didn't really know, but it was something that I wanted to answer. You know, what happens to a kid that has a really tough start in life? Where do they end up? I knew that I wanted to answer it in All the Colours of the Dark, but I knew that to answer it, I would have to follow these kids from 13 into adulthood, and that would change kind of everything about the book. You know, it pushed it definitely from being a mystery, or the mystery that I pitched, into being more closer to general fiction. You know, it became a book about first love and family and coming of age, and the mystery was secondary. So I missed my deadline by 3 years, and luckily, like my editors were so cool. Like UK, US, they just gave me the freedom to do it. Like in the UK, I met my editor every few months at the same cafe in London for 3 years, and he just checked in to make sure I was still writing. I was still a writer, and then I got near to the end of it, and it looked like the pitch that I just gave you was still there, but it just felt like a much bigger book.
Mm. And Liz, you mentioned that it sounds like sort of the sense of place maybe came to you first. And Chris, you mentioned the story of the two people falling in love come to you first, but also there is a really solid sense of place in your book as well. And I'm so curious reading this and knowing you're from the UK, how or why did you decide to set this, it takes place mainly in the Midwest, but then, Patch travels across the country. I'm curious how you decided you wanted to set this novel in America, specifically the Midwest.
So America, because I left school with no qualifications at all. I got really drunk the night before my economics exam, and then I just didn't go to the exam the next day, and I got a grade N in economics, which I didn't know was a grade, and I remember my economics teacher told me that the N stands for no future. And I know, it's just the worst thing you can say to a kid. And then sadly, he died before I got successful. So I did leave a copy of the book on his grave. But, so I left school with, I was one of those kids completely directionless, didn't know what I wanted to do, definitely didn't want to be a writer. I went to a really rough school in London. And Amy Winehouse went to my school. She was the only person that I knew that kind of went into something creative, but I didn't want to be a writer. I was doing loads of different jobs, and then I was mugged one morning. Someone came up to me and asked to borrow my cell phone, and because he wasn't very big and I'd been in loads of fights as a kid, I thought I'll fight him instead of giving him my cell phone. What's the worst that can happen? And the worst that can happen is he pulled out a knife. And I remember it was such a big knife. I remember thinking he wasn't going to use it, and I thought he was punching me, and I didn't know he was stabbing me. And he stepped back and stared at me, and I was covered in blood. And it was such a big knife; it had gone through my side and come out my back. And I still wouldn't give him my phone, so crazily. So I will wrap the story up because it's a long story. But I had a load of stitches. Was okay, but suffered badly with PTSD. I didn't know it was PTSD at the time, but I also had a group of friends that did the toxic male thing, and my dad did it a bit, kind of slapped me on the back, expect me to get on with it, and I ended up in the library, and I borrowed a self-help book that looked at writing as therapy, and I'm going to answer your question now. So the rules for writing as therapy were you had to take the traumatic incident, so the stabbing, you had to take it and you had to write about it, but you had to change the people involved to fictional characters. You had to change the outcome to something you could control. You had to change the location to the last place you were happy. And as a 19-year-old, I looked back at my life, and my parents split up and my dad left, and he came back and took me and my brother to Disney World in the US when I was 9. So my happy place for my writing was America. So my life in London was kind of falling apart, but I could sit down and mentally travel 4,000 miles to the US and set my writing there. So, and I've done that ever since. It's still escapism. I still do that every time I sit down to write.
That's a great answer. That's very great. And both Liz and Chris, this is for both of y'all, both of you set your books, yours takes place across like the 50s, 60s, 70s, yes, and then yours takes place like 70s up to present day. I was curious about each of your decision to set or start your stories in the past. Why did you choose to do that? And did that take like a lot of research to do, or how did you go about that?
Yeah, mine partly was a lot of the book's inspiration came out of oral storytelling that my family had done. So stories that my grandmother had heard from her grandparents that she passed to my mother and me. And Garrow, who I keep mentioning, was a real active presence in the 70s, which was the decade before I was born. But my parents and my aunt and my uncle still talked about Garrow as like everybody was frightened of him. You heard a noise in the woods and you thought it was Garrow. So that atmospheric kind of that storytelling caused me to set it around the time when my parents were most actively there in the Adirondacks, right before they had kids, understandably. I also thought it was interesting. There's a lot of, I guess, discussion, characters coming to terms with what it means to be a woman in different sections of society. So at every level, whether it's among the working class or among the very privileged Van Laar family, who are at the center of the book, women experience being sidelined in various ways. And I thought it would be interesting to set the novel in the context of the decade in which, you know, the women's movement was in full swing, but really elsewhere in the country. So that in this rural place, many of the women would have been aware of these big changes underfoot mainly in cities, but it hadn't yet reached them. And so it always felt to them, it feels to them in the book like something that's just out of reach, out of sight. So I liked that tension for some of the themes in the book as well.
There's loads of reasons why I say it then. Partly, historically, it was really important. Roe versus Wade plays a big role in the book. So I needed to go back there. And also, the kid in the book that kind of goes looking for this girl that no one believes exists. His name is Patch, and I wanted to write like a simple love story at the beginning of it, and I didn't want anything to get in the way. And like, we're really visual now, aren't we? And like, I think of my kids on TikTok and the instant gratification constantly. And I wanted to go back to a time before that, and you have these two kids that are in the basement and they're stripped of everything. You know, they have nothing, they just have their voices. And they get through this really difficult time together, and then that was the beginning of the love story. And then Patch gets out, and when he can't find this girl, he has to go searching for her, and there's no internet, and he has to do it, you know, he does it with a map, and he gets on his bike, and he draws things on his map, and I wanted him to discover art as well, you know, because art kind of saved my life. I wouldn't have been a writer, I wouldn't have picked up a pen had I not been stabbed. And Patch, in the same way, he begins to paint his idea of what this girl looks like, this missing girl. He's never seen her, but he discovers that he's a really talented artist. And he is a kid that would never have picked up a paintbrush had he not been through this trauma. So he begins painting her, and he becomes it's not a spoiler, he becomes a wealthy, successful artist. And so that the story was a lot about, you know, the good things that come into your life from a seemingly awful situation.
And you both write in a genre that I would call literary suspense. Does that sound accurate to you? And I'm curious what it is that draws both of you to this genre, and if, I guess, you know, you sort of set out to write books in this genre, or maybe you just started writing and kind of it evolved into the fact that this is something that you enjoyed doing and sort of spoke with you. What draws you to it, and was it sort of like a natural sort of thing for you?
I very much drifted sideways into it, and I'm happy to be here. But my very first book that I ever published was a collection of stories. I think the publishers called it a novel in stories about the music industry in just after the turn of the millennium in New York City, and it had no suspense, which was part of the reason that maybe like 40 people read it. But after that, my next two novels were not categorized at all or marketed as mysteries, and yet each one of them had a sort of mystery at its center. A book of mine called Heft had a mystery of, let's say, like paternity or genealogy, and a book of mine called The Unseen World had a mystery of identity. One of the characters had invented an identity for himself, and his daughter had to figure out who he really was and why he lied. So it occurred to me that I actually did like plot. I just didn't know that at first. And then with my fourth novel, which was Long Bright River, that too began in a place that was outside the world of mystery or suspense. It began with two sisters, one of whom was a teacher, actually, and one of whom was addicted to opioids and living on and off the street and went missing. But what I found was that somebody always has to have access to the files if somebody else is missing. And so the sister who was the teacher, I wrote and wrote in that vein for a long time, and then was like, what if she was a police officer instead, and suddenly the book was born from there. And the book was, I think I switched publishers for that book, and they really embraced the idea that the book was in some ways a police procedural. It has a blue cover. It has what I thought at first were knife marks on the front, but are actually raindrops. But they really leaned in to the aesthetic of literary suspense. And that book was kind of similar to you. It was like a breakout for me, and it reached a whole new audience that I had never had before. And so now I'm very happy to live in this space of like, I write the books that I wish to write, and I let the publishers decide what they want to call it and how they want to market it. And I'm a huge fan of a lot of mysteries and thrillers, and so I'm honored to be in that genre and in their company. So yeah, you all can decide what the books are. I'll just keep writing them, I guess.
Yeah, same. Do you know why it was your breakout book? Like, have you ever looked back at it and thought, why that book?
I think partly it was switching publishers. There was just sort of like a new energy, which sometimes unfortunately happens. I loved my first publisher very much, and I think very highly of them, but sometimes it's like it's sort of an injection of energy. And then I think there is a kind of, what was explained to me, and I'm curious, I bet there's a lot of readers of thrillers and mysteries in this room, and I'm curious if you think this is true. I'm just going to tell you what my publisher at the time said. They said it's easier to get readers of literary fiction to cross over into thriller than it is for readers of thrillers to cross over into literary fiction. Polarizing thesis statement. I wonder if it rings true or if there are any angry... I didn't say it, somebody else said it. But I think that was their reasoning for sort of leaning in, and I have to say they were correct. It worked.
I think it's right. I think that is true. I worked in the library for one of my many jobs. I worked in the library. It was like my best job that I've ever had. And I played around with shelving, we begin at the end, in different places. And if I put it in general fiction, it got borrowed 10 times more than in crime. So you had people that just would not go into that. I don't know if there was a preconceived idea that you're going to get a Lee Child book or a James Patterson book, and the breadth of books in crime, was there, but no one really went in there. And I used to, I worked in the library during lockdown, and you couldn't come into the library, but you could email in and just tick a box to say what genre of book you wanted. And no matter what you ticked, I would give you my book. And so, because not only do you get paid in the UK for lending your book out, you get... I also, I could find something in it. So if you wanted a romance, I would find a romance within that book. So I'm like you, I sit down and I write the book, and the last thing I think about is who's going to read it, how's it going to be marketed, what's the cover going to look like, how are they going to publish it. Because luckily there's some really talented people that have to do that. And I think that in my books, the crime is the least interesting thing in the story. And it's never gratuitous, and it's over very quickly, and it's about how people cope and get by and what happens next. And in all of the books, there's teenagers going through a difficult time because it's what I know, it's my life.
And it's so interesting what you just said about, the crime is sort of never the most interesting part, and it's not overly gratuitous. And what I loved about both of your books is that, you have the plottiness, you want to keep turning to figure out what happens, but along the way, the sentences at the line level are really craft-focused and interesting, and so you're sort of entertained by the writing, but also by the plot, which can be a hard thing to marry, and a lot of books don't do that. And so I'm curious if that, how you sort of strike that balance, and Liz, if you sort of have a similar sensibility of, yes, this sort of like crime or thriller is propelling the plot, but it isn't necessarily the most important thing about the book, or how do you all think about that?
I think it's very hard to separate. I direct the MFA program in creative writing at Temple University in Philadelphia, and one of the things that we spend a lot of time talking about in workshop is how sentences reflect themes, reflect the book as a whole, and ideally, form and function are married as well. And I can't, the voice of a book is so specific to that book. I can't imagine telling that particular story in a different voice. So it's very difficult for me to separate out. In fact, I think I have to find, I can write and write and write if I have a story idea, but it's all false starts until I find the voice for the book, and then it really goes. Is that
Yeah,
true for you as
yeah,
well?
the same sort of thing. I write out of order
Yeah.
as well, kind of like how they film TV. And I will sit down on any given day and write whatever I feel like writing. And I always get asked about writer's block. People always want to know, what do you do when you get writer's block? And I never do, because I just switch and write something else that maybe doesn't feel like it belongs in the story, but invariably it does. It'll be something that comes later on. And so I never get too caught up in. I know that there is a crime in the book, and it kind of is. It's a bit like True North, it keeps me pointing in the right direction, but I will go off, for 10,000 words in the wrong direction. I do it all the time. And it used to really bother me. I used to think it's wasteful, but now it's just like a necessary part of getting to where I need to go.
You'll skip around, create a new point of view that you weren't
Yeah.
writing in before, or a new location. Or,
Yeah. And often I burn it as well.
Yeah.
But it just feels like it's needed.
Yep. I think that's right. You have to get through that stuff to figure out the next thing, in my experience.
Yeah.
And both of your books are so sprawling. They take place across decades, across POVs. I'm curious, are you all outliners or plotters at the beginning, or as you're writing, do you sort of have some sort of I don't know, Excel spreadsheet that's helping you keep track of everything, or do you just sort of sit down and let the magic take you where it will?
There is no magic writing.
I mean, my experience is there's no magic at all, but I don't know, maybe you guys are right.
Do you have the murder board? Do you have
I don't.
the web, the Spider-Man
I
web?
think that would help,
Yeah.
but no, I have no notes, no plan at all, nothing at all, and I just have a vague sense. I know what the ending is going to be. I know where I'm heading. I knew that I wanted to answer the question: if you're a kid and has a difficult start in life, can you still kind of dictate the ending to your own story? I knew I wanted to answer that question with these characters, but how I get there it's just such a mess. I think I wrote 500,000 words for a book that is 120,000 words. So it's just, there is no plan.
Same. The one concession I make, so I never pre-plan or outline, but I do make a concession, which is a separate Microsoft Word document called Timeline for every book. And whenever I name a date, I put it in that other document. And I can adjust those dates, but at least if I need to know, how old is this person in 1974, I don't have to zoom back in my manuscript too far. I'll know when they were born, and then I can.
That is a much better way of doing it. I do that, when you're at copy edit stage, and you begin to why is this character 30 years older than they were in the last chapter? So I do it. I begin. I begin to pull it back together at that point. But it's that's the tough part.
Yeah. Yes. A good copy editor is our friend.
Mine is so good.
Yeah.
My copy editor for this book, they had I'd put this random date in the 70s, and I'd said that there was a half moon, and they put in the margin, I think you'll find that was a full moon.
I think you'll find.
Yeah, but I really enjoy that level of because invariably whoever knows that fact will read my book and then message me on Instagram.
Oh, they'll let you know.
I get that a lot. Do you get that?
I get that all the time. I've had so many people tell me, oh, wait, hold on. I've had so many people tell me that it's impossible for one of the characters in my book to have known the term punk in 1975, to which I say, it is absolutely possible, because the term punk was first used in Cream magazine in 1973, and the character subscribed to Cream magazine. But it's just a lot of people.
Do you answer?
No, I want in my head. I'm answering at every event. If you thought about telling me that at the signing line, let me tell you in advance that you are. But also, I don't know. I think, Yeah, that's it. That's all I got.
So if anyone was going to ask that question, you can leave the room
don't,
now.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so this sort of touches back to what we were talking about a little bit earlier, but obviously both your books deal with some dark, heavy themes. But I wouldn't think of either of your books as like dark books. There's a good balance there. And I'm curious how you sort of try to keep that balance. Is it maybe sort of leaning into the character stories, or how do you keep like a little bit of lightness in your book?
I think it's just remembering it isn't one thing, the story. I'm writing someone's life story effectively. The book spans 27 years. Not all of that is going to be taken up with, a search for a missing person. There's going to be loads of laughter and loads of light, and so it's remembering that. And I also need it when I'm writing. I let it bleed into my personal life when I'm writing, and if it's not going well, it just feels like the end of the world sometimes. And you're just kind of down, and I'm not. I know that I'm not the same parent and partner. I know that I'm slightly off and slightly down, and this can go on for months.
That's happening right now.
Really?
In my writing practice.
Yeah, and it's really hard, isn't it? And you feel like every time I finish a book, I genuinely think I won't do it again, and I really do mean it as well, because I think it's probably not worth it. And then I fall in love with a new story, and will of course do it again, but it just
stinks.
Yeah, it really does.
It does. I don't know, lightness. One of the things that I love to do, whether it's in novel writing or screenwriting, is to have a character surprise the reader and potentially other characters with an act of kindness that no one was expecting from that character. And I actually think that happens a lot in life too. I think with The God of the Woods, it was very important to me not to portray, to accurately portray a group of 12 and 13-year-old girls as having the capacity for viciousness, but also not leaving it there. Because in my experience, like, I had such wonderful, funny times with girlfriends at that age. And so there's a long meditative passage in the book, which I think my editor probably wanted me to cut because it advanced the plot in no way. But it was just about how, like, that is also a time in life that is arguably like the funniest. Like, I laughed the hardest I've ever laughed at ages 12 and 13 with girlfriends. And so that I made sure, I think, maybe not consciously, but I tried to stay true to my own recollection of those years by including that as well, and including some of the more lighthearted parts of being a girl of that age.
And so both of your books, you have missing girls, missing women, and it's so interesting to me watching this sort of like current pop culture fascination we have with true crime and missing people, especially missing women. I'm curious what y'all's thoughts are on that, and I think it kind of also again goes back to that point we had about where the crime isn't the focus of the story, right? You're not being gratuitous with it. What are your thoughts like sort of like on this pop culture fascination we have with the missing and all of that?
I am not that into it, really. I can appreciate it, and I think it's an extension of reading crime fiction, and if you're entertained by that, it's not a stretch to go and listen to a podcast and be entertained by that, but I can never get my head around the tragedy, in it, and it's not for me. I think because I've lived through some of that stuff in my life, the reality of it is so different. It's like every time someone writes or films a violent scene, I think you've got this completely wrong. And it's so different, when it happens, and it feels really personal, and it's really hard to shake the memory off. And there's just a tone that is kind of wrong. But I suppose that's where true crime kind of bridges that gap, because you're still being entertained, but you're getting to hear about exactly what happened. And it's just not something I've gotten into. I don't know if you listen to it or...
No, I let's see. I think I probably have listened to, I remember being very interested in Serial when that was sort of like my introduction to podcasts, which is a sort of true crime. I think it can be done very well and very intelligently and intentionally. And I think it can be done sort of exploitatively as well. And certainly both kinds of true crime exist in the world. I don't know, the fascination with the missing, it's not, I don't think it's new. Like when you know, when I think about my introduction to the genre of mystery, it was all like golden age detective fiction, you know, lady writers of the early 20th century exploring murder or disappearances. And I think, I don't know, human instinct is to solve problems. And when I talk about writing, again, with my students, or when I coach myself through writing, as I'm doing right now, I think, what is the problem that these characters have to solve? And a very obvious one is a disappeared person, you know, or a crime that hasn't been solved yet. And that's true, you know, outside of the genre as well. Like a lie that is told, a betrayal, you know, whatever it is, it's a problem that needs fixing. And inherently, that's kind of just like a narrative mechanism that drives fiction in a suspenseful way.
Yeah. And so, I don't know if you guys know this, but you're both massive successes. Congrats. Your books have been extremely popular. And I'm curious if that is like a lot of pressure, and if, you know, writing the next one, if you sort of like have in the back of your mind, like, okay, well, this last one did really well, and this is what I wrote about in this last one, it seems like what people like. If that sort of, I don't know, is hanging over your head or, you know, over your shoulder while you're writing, or if you can just sort of be like, you know what, nope, I'm going to write what I want to write.
I am feeling the pressure, but only more because of the time has gone. You know, like we were talking about this just now. I've been on tour for like a year and a half, and which is a really long time to be touring. And I'll have done 28 states in the US, in over 7 tours, and Australia, and just all around the world. And that leaves very little time for actually writing. And my publisher want the book like now. They wanted it last Christmas, and the Christmas before that, and then now they want it in the spring. And I'm someone that likes to disappear for a while, you know, and spend a few years writing a book. And I've learned, or I'm starting to learn, that time has probably gone. When I will be able to realistically do that, unless I'm a book every 6 years or something, which is too long. So it's learning how to write and then go on tour and then come back and pick up where you left off, and then. But I like to really immerse myself in it, and so I'm finding that hard. But pressure-wise, it's difficult because I began writing All the Colours of the Dark before We Begin at the End came out, you know, so I didn't really, you know, I was just writing for me the entire time. I didn't have lots of people waiting. So I'd like to think it hasn't changed anything, because it's still, the fundamentals are the same. It's still me sitting down and writing a story and getting lost in that story and getting my characters from A to wherever they're going. So I'll find out, I guess. You would know better than me.
No, I mean, I think it's funny, we've had very similar trajectories. When I think about the math of like the books we published early, and then now sort of like 2 books that have broken through.
I remember I messaged Liz and I said I messaged Liz about a year ago and I said it appears that we've written the same book.
Yeah. That's right. I know. For a long time, because they're both set in 1975, right?
Yeah.
And both missing.
And the covers kind of have
the covers were similar.
They're quite similar.
Great minds think alike. What can I say?
Yeah.
But no, I think one of the things I'm most grateful for in my career is that I wasn't actually an overnight success in any way, and that my career has really been a slow build over 20 years at this point. Because what it has taught me, first of all, is how to handle disappointment, which, you know, I experienced in some way here or there for some of my early books. And then also philosophically and just statistically or mathematically, I know that at a certain point, you know, you have already published the book that will do the best in your career. And that maybe I'm at that point. I don't know. And that's okay. Like in the best possible world, I would keep writing books that I'm interested in writing, and my career might go like this, you know. Hopefully it won't go like this. That's the one the one thing I hope it doesn't do. But I'm okay with sort of now, I do feel like I've found my readership, and let's hang out for the rest of my working life, and let's hopefully if I write a book you don't like, you'll stick around for the one after that. We're kind of all in this together. Sorry.
Yeah, maybe there's less pressure on us because we did it the right way round, or a better way round. Like in publishing, particularly in the UK, everyone is looking for the debut, for the shiny new thing.
Right.
And invariably, your first book isn't your best book. I'm a much better writer now than I was 2 books ago, even 1 book ago. I feel like I'm more accomplished. I could never have written All the Colours of the Dark at the beginning of my career. So we did it the right way round. In any other job, the longer you spend doing it, the better you get, the more you get paid. It should be like that. But I know so many authors that got the big 7-figure debut deal and then couldn't follow it up, because it's impossible, the pressure. And that, I mean, I'd like to have the 7 figures instead. But I'm pleased that I'm pleased that my best book did the best.
At some point we should probably check in with each other and see what we're writing about.
Just co-write one.
Just off screen, offline.
Yeah.
And speaking of success, both of your books have, I think, things in the works as far as transitioning to screen. Well, obviously, the show Long Bright River came out. I'm curious if you can give us sort of updates on what's happening there, or
so much of it is secret and has to be.
Yeah.
Are you able to tell?
Can we break any news
Do you know
here?
what? I'm not able to tell, but I always just say it.
You just say it,
because so far I've never got into any real trouble for it. Because you're sworn to secrecy and stuff. But
in this room.
in this room. There are 2 episodes written of All the Colours of the Dark, and 4 seasons from 1 book, so a lot of TV. With Universal, and I don't know, I'm just, they made me an exec producer, which I think they think is a throwaway title, but I took that to mean that when the script comes to me, and I actually did this, I crossed out every line and rewrote the entire thing, and sent it back again. And I did that, and they completely ignored it. It was like in the email chain, it was like I hadn't even sent it back. They just skipped it out. And so I've learnt my place, kind of. Yeah.
You do. You learn your place really, really quickly on TV. I, on Long Bright River, was a co-creator and a co-writer and an executive producer.
That sounds better.
So I was, I was in the writer's room. I co-wrote 4 of the 8 episodes, and I was on set quite a bit. Which was a really eye-opening experience. You sort of feel like you earn a degree in something over the course of the however many years it takes, and it was fascinating. I feel like it opened parts of my brain that I hadn't used before. I think I'm a rule follower. I think I'm allowed to say that The God of the Woods and The Unseen World are also currently they have been acquired for production by Sony. I can't say where they are in the process, but I can say I'm involved. That's what I can say.
That's good. I think the Sony people no one's taking the door down here. I think
no,
that's good.
No.
And so it sounds like, obviously, you co-wrote Long Bright River, and you dabbled a little in the screenwriting on your projects. How does screenwriting, especially taking a novel that you wrote with all of this interiority and then putting it into screenwriting format, what is that like, and do you feel like you sort of learned new writing processes and tactics in doing that?
Yes. One of the things that I think is really helpful about having to write a screenplay is having to think about how every single scene, because it's so much tighter, has to both build character and advance story. In fiction, I'm able to have long soliloquies about 12 and 13-year-old girls are like flocks of birds because they're constantly pivoting all together, and they have a great sense of humor. But if in screenwriting, there's not really a place for that unless you have a voice of God narrator, which I'm not that type of screenwriter. So it's about developing the muscle of story and character at the same time, which I can be a little more relaxed about in my fiction.
I didn't enjoy it. So when I did it, so someone approached me to do something, and I spent a year writing it and then just quit because I hated it. Because I think for now I'm supposed to write books, and I just found the process just too. Yeah, there was something cold about a script, you know, that I couldn't get my head round. Like I got sent something and it talked about someone going into a room and I wanted to know everything about the room and I wanted to describe it, and that's probably not my job.
No, it has to be like a busy cafeteria,
Yeah.
period.
Yeah, but who's in there? What does it
No, I
smell
know.
like? What are the other people talking about? I want to know every detail, and it's my job as an author to build that world, and it's probably not my job as a screenwriter. So, and I find it really hard to turn down work because I grew up with no money. So to turn down something like that it was a big step for me, you know, to say I'm not enjoying this, I'm not going to do it, I'm going to get on with writing another book. But for now, you know, I'm glad that I did.
And so what's next for each of you? I mean, I'm assuming you're, hopefully, fingers crossed, working on next projects. Can you tell us a little bit about maybe? I don't know.
I can't because I'm deeply superstitious, but
Okay.
I will talk to Chris about it off stage.
Okay.
We're not writing.
So maybe someone can
Yeah.
eavesdrop. you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah, no.
Well, I'll just tell you all. So afterwards, I'll come and find you all and tell you everything. I'm writing a book called The Timekeeper, and it's a love story. I feel like I've been getting less and less crime with every book, and now this one's completely out of that genre and is general fiction. And it looks at the idea of fate and time and how much control we have over those things. And it will be with you in about 30 years.
Can't wait. See you guys
Yeah.
here in 30 years. It'll be awesome. Was that like a conscious decision you made to do something that was a little bit different than?
Not really. It was just the idea that I had. Like, I'm one of those weird people that only ever can work on one book, an idea at a time. Like, I never know what the next book will be. And I have friends and you know lots of authors that will know their next like 10 books, all these ideas. And I'm just so into the thing that I'm doing, I can't see beyond it.
Is it going well?
No, it's not going well. It never goes well, does it? It never goes well until it does at the very end, and you begin to pull everything together.
Yeah.
But I really miss it. I do really miss sitting down and writing. I need it. Like mental health-wise, I feel better. I feel more grounded when I write, and I've kind of lost track of that slightly over the last year, and definitely don't feel as good as I would normally. But I'm jet lagged a lot as well, which doesn't help, you know.
Yeah.
Forever on a different time zone.
Yeah. Are you each able to write when you're like touring and traveling, or is it
I don't.
you got to
I
be
don't,
home like in
no.
your routine?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I can't write on a laptop. I write on 3 screens, like
Yeah.
massive. Like I have a lot of space. I need.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it sounds like you need your
I do write on a laptop, but I need my routine. I just want to get up, and I get up at 5. I write about 5:30 to 7:30 a.m. and I have my place that I write, and I'm a little bit rigid about it, like many things in my life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you all are you really hardcore disciplined about when you're in something, you're waking up at every single time and sort of writing at the same time, or is it sort of more like an organic like process to you?
I'm more disciplined.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm disciplined, but it like takes over. You know, I will go to sleep in the early hours, and then if there is a paragraph that bothers me, I will lie awake thinking about it, and then I'll have to get up and change it, and then before I can go back to sleep, and it all starts to get a bit, you know, obsessive.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have been trying to ask myself lately, is this disciplined or is it compulsive? Like, is it
Yeah.
disordered? Is there some pathology to it? Which the answer may be yes, but I don't care enough to go
No.
into therapy.
Nor
Yeah.
should you. No.
Yeah.
Me and Liz never get nervous for anything, which we've decided is a problem.
Yeah.
But there's definitely something wrong.
Sign of
Yeah.
sociopathy or
Sociopathy.
something.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not up to me to diagnose you guys, but you know, if you want an opinion, we could talk about it offline.
I get nervous about insects, though. I get nervous about, like, I have particular phobias.
Insects.
So does that prevent me from being
You are
sociopath?
less of a sociopath
Right,
than
great.
I am.
Yeah.
Chris is afraid of nothing.
Yeah.
Well, I think we can open it up to the audience now, too, if there are folks that have questions. There are 2 microphones at the front of each aisle here. So if you have a question, if you would come up, and it looks like
It's kind of daunting, isn't it?
Wow.
Like you can't
Okay.
walk. Yeah, well done.
line up and, oh, hi.
Hi,
Oh, hey.
I'm Sarah.
Sarah.
Thank you for being here. What, question for both of you. Did you read a book as a child that kind of like sparked that interest in reading or art in general? And then what are you both reading now?
Yeah, as a child, I was a very, very basic child of the 80s. Loved the Babysitters Club, loved the 90s, really, I guess. I loved Beverly Cleary and Judy Blume were very important to me. There was a series of books. They were all like, oh my gosh, somebody will immediately know. It was like Tales of a Fifth Grade Nothing. Sixth
Yeah.
grade
Yeah.
something, seventh grade. I was really into those. Yeah, anything. I just discovered character through those books. Beverly Cleary is so good at like small human interactions between children and adults, and really poignant. Like, I loved that she wrote her adult characters as thoughtfully as her child characters. Let's see, right now I'm reading, in preparation for teaching it actually, Devil is Fine by John Vercher, which is great. He's a Philly-based author, and I strongly recommend that book.
As a kid, I read Stephen King when I was really little, because my dad had a shelf that was forbidden of books, and until I was 11 when I read it, and that was the first adult book that I ever read, and it was like really eye-opening because I'd only read kids' books, and then all of a sudden there was, because I didn't get why anything like written should be off limits. I knew about swear words and things and sex and stuff like that, but I didn't know a book could be so terrifying. So it opened my eyes to what a storytelling can do. And I've just finished reading Buckeye by Patrick Ryan, and it is one of the best books I've read in like a decade. I think it came out like 2 days ago or something. It is so incredibly good. Yeah, I highly recommend it.
Thank you.
Hey guys.
Hi.
Hey.
I have a question for Chris. So it sounds like, and please correct me if I'm wrong, your starting point was the love story in the dark, and then it sounds like it was working with your PTSD. At what point did Saint, who seems like the narrative force in your story, like when did she emerge in your process, and then how quickly did you know she was going to play such a big role in that narrative?
I had Patch and Saint first. They were like, I start with the character. I had this strong visual image of these two characters. I knew Saint wasn't going to be the missing girl. She was going to be Patch's best friend. And I had a really difficult childhood, and my mum's partner was physically abusive. And I think I wrote the character that I needed when I was a kid, you know. And I wanted Patch to have Saint. You know, I wanted him to have this moral compass. I wanted him to have this person that will forsake everything for him. You know, that I wanted to write a book about friendship because I find it so fascinating. You know, with a love story, there's attraction and there's all these obvious things at play. Friendship is so much more nuanced and so much more interesting. And so I wanted Patch to have Saint, and I wanted their friendship to be the kind of core of the book, you know, the thing that pulls everything together. So I started with them both, but didn't know where her story would go necessarily. I knew that the search for the missing girl would be the heart of the story, you know, pin everything together. And I knew that one of the themes of the book would be sacrifice. So Saint ends up giving up so much to join Patch on this search, because some of the hardest scenes to write were when Patch comes back, because she lost him, and she lost this boy that she loves totally, and then he comes back and he's someone else. And the boy that comes back isn't the person she recognises, and so she realises that part of him is still trapped in that basement looking for this girl, and the only way to bring all of him home is to join him on this kind of crazy search, because she's not sure if the girl is real, and she gives up most of her life to join him and searches in a different way. But yeah, it's the two of them, and particularly Saint, that I get messaged most about the book. You know, every day someone will message me about Saint. And there are Saint tattoos out there and really cool things like that. Thanks.
Hello, thank you. I think we hear that authors write about what they know about, what they've experienced, where they grew up. Can you expound upon how your own history has fashioned your books?
Yeah, let's see. I write all the time about characters feeling socially outside of a particular situation, I draw from my own experience as a very unsocially skilled child. When I write those characters, I hated being a kid. I hated, you know, being, particularly like actually my youngest years in elementary school, I just had no clue what social skills were, basically. And so many of my characters are operating kind of like outside of a group. I write a lot about class intersections. I grew up in a town called Framingham, Massachusetts, which has a lot of class intersections. Framingham, for many years, was sort of the working class town surrounded by wealthier towns in Massachusetts. Now, like many Boston suburbs, it's become very pricey, and you know it's much different than it was when I grew up there. But I think I was always, maybe because I was sort of on the outside of things a lot, the good news about that is it gives you a lot of time to kind of just observe from the periphery. And so I liked to, and I still like to, watch people from different backgrounds or different communities come together and just sort of see what happens when you put them together in a room. And a lot of my fiction does that, I think.
I write about sliding doors moments because I find it really interesting, you know, that we're one decision away from a different ending to our lives. And I kind of tracked I could plot every decision made and everything that's happened to me, good and bad, that's led me to this exact moment here now answering this question, and I find it really interesting. I think that, you know, like I used to wonder why, when I was stabbed, why didn't I just give the person my phone? You know, any sane person would do that. And I think that my mum's boyfriend broke my arm when I was a kid, and I think that I didn't like feeling like a victim, like like stripped of power as a kid. You know, I couldn't fight back against an adult. But now that I'm 19, even though you've got a knife, I will keep, you know, swinging until I get killed. So, I think if I hadn't had my arm broken, I wouldn't have been stabbed. And if I hadn't been stabbed, I wouldn't have gone to the library and borrowed a book about writing as PTSD, for PTSD therapy. And then I wouldn't have found out that I need writing. And I wouldn't have ended up here talking about a book that I absolutely couldn't have written had I not been through some of similar experiences to the characters in the story. So there is always, you know, this. It's not a plan, because I don't believe in that sort of thing, but, you know, there is definitely a positivity that I've taken from, and certainly amazing things have happened to me, you know, because of, and I can track it all the way back, because I had such a difficult childhood. You know, I ended up doing the thing that I'm supposed to have done that I possibly wouldn't have found my way to in any other way, so.
Hi, you may have covered this already, but I was part of the standing room only line. I'm not sure if
Oh, man.
it stretched all around the building, so
Oh my
we're glad to
gosh,
be here.
that's cool.
Both of your stories are set in the 1970s, and what attracted you to that time period to set your stories in?
So I'm so sorry to say that we did actually answer that question. Let me give you the
Can you review?
Yes,
Can you
yes, yes.
recap
The
that?
briefest, I'm going to speak in keywords. The women's rights movement, a real serial killer named Robert Garrow, who was actually haunting the Adirondack Mountains in the 1970s, and family history in the area during that decade.
And mine, I will just meander through this, because
Yeah.
so mine was partly Roe versus Wade plays a big part of the story. So it was going back to then, and it was wanting the protagonist, Patch, in the story to find his way to art, and he needed to do that by painting his idea of what the girl looked like, and he probably wouldn't have done that had he had access to everything that we have access to now.
It is very nice to set things pre-cell phones.
Yeah, I
yeah.
never have it. I
That's
never
what
have
I was
any
talking
social
about.
media.
Highly recommend.
And
Yeah.
one comment, I'm a proud public librarian, and both of your books have been on my recommended reading list for the last year and a half.
Great.
Thank you
Thanks
very
for
much.
being a public librarian.
That was a perfect tee up, because my question is actually about trying to write in the modern age. So obviously I agree that it would be almost impossible to write a missing person story that takes place right now, because we all track each other at all time. We know where we are. So are you also, I think, trying to write anything, our culture just moves so quickly because of technology and the internet, so that if you try to write something, by the time it comes out, it's already so dated, and you can see that in like movies and whatever. But are you interested in contending with this? Do you see people that are doing interesting things, setting either like mystery or suspense or thriller in the modern age and kind of like working around the technology? Have you tried to do that? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I actually wrote a whole book about this very thing. It's called The Unseen World. I published it in 2016. I began writing it in about probably 2011. And it's about the dawn of natural language processing and AI. And when I began it, it was, I sort of wrote about training a machine to speak like a human. And now we have far surpassed that. So it's a very weird experience to go back and think about much of what I was writing in that book, which was purely fantasy at the time, and to see how it's come to life. The anxiety-producing thing about writing that book was I was sort of racing against technology. I beat it in the sense that like no machine had really passed the Turing test when I published it in 2016. But other things had happened that I did have to kind of swerve to include. Now, I don't know. I mean, I'm not. I have written. I'll just talk about like Long Bright River, for example. That's a contemporary novel. There is a presence of cell phones, even while making the film adaptation, or the TV adaptation, which we updated a bit. That's an annoying part of, you're always like, well, how are we going to render it big enough on the screen? But you can't have characters not texting one another. That's what we do.
Yeah.
I don't know. You just sort of roll with the punches on that one, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's me shying away from something that I don't understand well enough and can't keep up with, certainly. Like, talking to my kids about it, like for them to conceive a world without internet is, it just blows their mind. What did you do? Like, how did you have 4 TV channels when you were a kid? They just can't comprehend it. So I'm always going back to a time that I feel more comfortable with and I kind of understand more. And if I were to set something now, I think the research would kill me into this, into this kind of world that I don't understand. And you're right, it would date so quickly. Not that I think there's necessarily anything wrong with that, because something will always be of its time. The other day was with my ex-wife, and I was telling my kids about The Sopranos. I'm a massive Sopranos fan.
Me too.
And she was like, she got so angry, and she said, you can't tell them that it's the greatest show ever made because it's so misogynistic, and it's, but it is a snapshot of a time, and a certain type of person. And it was really interesting to see it, to try and protect them from something that you can't protect them from, because they will go and watch movies from whenever, it was just. Yeah.
Now I'm hung up on The Sopranos being misogynistic. It depicts misogyny.
I think all the beating up women.
You can't have Edie Falco as Carmela Soprano in a show and like not see value in that.
Yeah.
I don't know. Talk about The Sopranos another time.
Thank you.
Any other questions? No? Well, those are wonderful questions. A great note to end on, The Sopranos. I mean, amazing. Okay. Thank you so much. This has been wonderful. Thank you.